All right, so our next step is going to be a discussion with some attendings where you can just ask them any questions you might have. And of course, since this is this multi-institutional program really focused on DE&I, you should feel free to ask whatever questions you may have. You can ask them anonymously through the Q&A section if you're worried about, you know, how it may reflect on you or any programs to apply to. But really, this is the chance to get the information that you're really curious about. So one attendee says, I know, oh, actually, first we should introduce ourselves. So we have Anand, do you want to go first?
Sure. Hey, so thanks for having me on. First, kudos to you, Dan, and this whole team for putting together this amazing program here. These students are amazing. It's an honor to be with you all today, and with Dr. Davis and Dr. Bradshaw on this panel. My name is Anand Narayan. I'm MGH. I'm the co-chair of our Diversity Inclusion Committee, and I'm a breast imager, and very happy to be here. So happy to answer questions as well too about some of the programs that we have going on and some of our joint collaborative efforts.
All right, next up we have Dr. Bradshaw, whose camera is sideways and is muted.
All right, at least you can hear me. I'll see if I can fix this whole sideways thing. Here we go, hold on. There we go. Hey, I'm Marcus Bradshaw. I'm a nuclear radiologist at Vanderbilt, and I am our Vice Chair of Diversity Affairs for the Department of Radiology, and happy to answer any questions that you have.
And then, of course, there is Dr. Davis, who we just had a lovely lecture from. So we'll get to the questions. Now here's first question. I know this is way down the line, but I thought it would be awkward to ask later. Is there a strategic way to go about sending an email to our #1 program? I would only want to send it to a program that I actually have a good chance of being ranked highly at, so I don't want to waste this #1 email. Is there a way to gauge whether I actually have a chance at ranking highly at a specific program, or have programs ever responded to these #1 emails with, we advise you rank a different program as #1?
Interesting question for sure. I think when you're on an interview, you should get some type of an idea in terms of how well those interviews went. Like, I think we all know when we've had an interaction with someone and it felt bad, then obviously I wouldn't send that to that particular program. But in terms of actually gaming the system and trying to figure out if they ranked you highly, I don't know that that's necessarily a possible thing to do. I would more focus on how I felt about that program, and if I had a program that was truly #1 for me, I would send it to that program. Now, do programs actually respond to those things? I think it's going to vary by different programs. Most of the programs that I've been at, if you sent something saying that I was your #1, we wouldn't respond even if we felt like you were our #1. So I think you just have to take that with a bit of a grain of salt.
Of course, it is worth noting that you should read up on what match violations are. It can really drive what programs will feel comfortable saying. Now, a program cannot specifically ask you if you've ranked them to match, but you are more than free to tell a program that you've ranked them to match. Let's see. Apparently my wife is vacuuming, so apologies for the background noise. IMGs, here we go. How do you optimize an application and market yourself as an IMG?
Correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I believe Yasha has done a whole a YouTube series on this, so I'm gonna take a look and see if I can find that and send that link.
Yes, I do have a video on that. I can put the link in.
And if you want to find the information later, of course, you can just navigate to our Rad Diversity website, go under interview tips, and you'll see a link to all of Yasha's videos. So does that mean it's fair to say that no one really has great advice on how to optimize applications for IMGs outside of the video? But I have seen it. It is a very good one.
Yeah, and I think that I think the personal statement actually might be very important for IMGs. I know that we were talking about personal statements before, but you know, a lot of us do. We don't always remember them when we're in the room, but a lot of us, like when I was doing interviews, and we interviewed a lot of IMGs at Yale, and I would basically I would read everything. I would be more like scanning the personal statement. So I think like within there is kind of your time to shine, as well as some of like the notes areas and the ERAS statement. I think that those are worth like paying attention to.
So you all have been involved with the interview process in some regard, though not specifically program directors. But what are program directors looking for, and how can an applicant stand out from the rest with how they set up their fourth year?
I always say like once you get to the interview stage, it's all about personality. So they're really looking for people who are not going to like that aren't going to be like super strange in the program, I guess is what I'm trying to say, yeah, in like the nicest way possible. But like it's really like find the real odd ringers and like people who rub people the wrong way during the interview process, people who said things that may have been, you know, like either sexist or racist or anything like that. You know, look for stuff like that, and weed them out. And then you have people who like really shine in the interviews, and you know that those people are going to kind of rise to the top. So really, it's all about personality once you're there. So you know that's like put your best foot forward on that day.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say your job on that interview is you're trying to make connections with people, right? Because if we can make a connection with you, then later on when we have to go back and score you, then I'm going to remember those people that I made a connection with, right? And as Melissa said, we want people that are normal. We want people that are hardworking. We want people that really want to be in our program. And Yasha touched on this earlier, but I would say 50% of the time when I ask somebody why Vanderbilt, I get some generic answer like it's in the region or blah, 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 blah. And I'm sorry, that just doesn't do it for me. And so you can stand out by having legitimate reasons why you're interested in our programs.
To echo a comment from Dr. Davis about what happens in the process, at that point, the application's already been screened for your clerkship grade, your scores, and other things like that as well too. So you've already passed a lot of those hurdles there. So at that point, the personality part becomes more dominant because you've already checked those boxes. So now you're kind of moving to a different phase of things at that point.
Yeah, and somebody was saying earlier about hobbies, like everybody looks at the hobbies, and that's true. We look at the hobbies because in the interview, we want to know if we can find the connection. And so we're going to ask you about hobbies until something kicks off, basically, and then we can have a conversation. So if we go through your hobbies and you're like, yes, I like hashtag writing. Yes, I like running. We're going to be like, oh, that was terrible. But if you're like, oh, I did a 10K, did you do a 10K? And then you're like, oh yeah, like I ran this, whatever, and we have a whole conversation about it. That person's at the top of the list afterwards. So
as a URM applicant, is it better to go to the URM interview weekend or to the standard interview weekend? I guess this would be for programs that have a specific URM interview weekend.
We don't have a specific weekend at Vanderbilt. We interview everybody as they select their dates. So I can't really speak on that.
I think Yale had a weekend, but it was not just for radiology. It was for like the entire school did it. And I think it was worth going because like one of the things as a URM that that you're always asking, at least I was always asking, is am I going to feel comfortable here or not? And so I think by going to something like that, you can see who else is looking, who you might be able to have shared experiences with, and make connections maybe outside of radiology, especially if they're not in radiology specifically. So I think it's more for you as opposed to for the program at that point.
One thing at MGH that we have, and we do this conjunction with Brigham as well too, is we have this Center for Diversity and Inclusion that puts on specific events at different times. And in the past, those things were in-person events, but now we have sort of virtual sort of receptions and events too as well, specifically for URIM applicants. And I think they can offer a lot of resources. And I think that the point that you made, Dr. Davis, as well too, about connecting people outside of radiology can be really helpful as well too, where you might be able to ask more pointed questions about things like culture and environment, and potentially access to broader communities as well too. It gives us a few examples too, like this is from a faculty standpoint as well too, but sometimes the community that you find may not necessarily be all in radiology. You might find people outside of that who are engaging in work that you're interested in. Say, for example, if you were interested in health services research, it may not be all radiology residency. You might work with a radiologist. You might be working a lot with internal medicine people or people from the health policy community. So sometimes forging those connections can sort of connect you with unique resources that are individual to you. And then also to sort of get a sense for what the broader resources are in the institution to support your individual goals as a trainee.
Mm-hmm. Then when I was interviewing for med school, I'd always hear, don't worry about where you go to med school. It's all the same. It only matters where you go to residency. Now I'm applying to residency and I'm hearing, don't worry where you go to residency. It's all the same. It only matters where you go to fellowship. At what point does it actually matter where we go?
I mean, nobody's asking me where I went to school now. So I like, honestly, like, you do what's best for you. It doesn't really matter ultimately where you go. I think there are some advantages. Like in undergrad, if you're at a high level school, it's probably easier for you to get into med school because I know that they do a scale of schools and grading. And so there's probably a benefit, a GPA benefit there. For, med schools, there is some bias. Like if we're being completely honest about med schools and when you're applying to residency programs, where residency programs will be like, oh, that person's at Harvard Med, so yeah, of course we're gonna interview them, as opposed to like that person's at some other school that's unknown, and that we might not interview them like that. I'm not saying that that's right, but I'm saying that that bias is there for some programs. And so you wanna be aware of that. Ultimately, in my mind, once you get into residency, I don't think the residency matters. I also don't think the fellowship matters, to be honest. I don't think any of it matters after that. And you're at the end of the day, you're going to be in a job and you're just going to figure out like what job you want to be in. If it's private practice, if it's academics, if it's whatever. I honestly think that there's way too much emphasis on naming, school namings and things like that. I do unfortunately think that there's some bias at the early stages of this, of getting into med school and getting into residency. So.
Right. Let's see, is it advisable to name drop the name of a mentor during an interview if you know they have a connection to your interviewer / the institution overall?
If you do that, you better make sure that that person knows you, because this community is small. And so they're going to definitely follow up on that name drop. So, and it's happened where people drop names and then you go and you call them and they're like, I have no idea who that person is. So if you're going to do that, make sure that your mentor knows that, or whoever you're going to name drop knows that. Make sure they're okay with that. And know that there's going to be follow-up.
I'd be curious for comments about this comment, Dr. Davis, but one thing that you could do in advance is if you're going to name drop and use some of these connections that you think are there at institutions, say for example, if somebody who's connected to people at Emory or Vanderbilt or MGH, you might want to just reach out to those people in advance and say, hey, if they're mentors for you and if they're sponsors for you, then have them be your resource. We're here as faculty members to stand up for you and to advocate for you in these situations, even if they're not necessarily formally part of a residency application process or fellowship application process, or whatever process you do, have those people that you know that you're trying to name drop for, have them advocate for you.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's a much better way of doing it. If there really are someone who's in your corner, then I'd rather for that person to call someone at my institution versus you just dropping the name. I've seen the name drop go badly, and the person who you dropped it on just felt like a little that was a little slimy, a little sleazy, that they were being played. And so if it doesn't go well, it can really hurt you.
That being said, I did name drop a lot in certain situations, and I would advise, like everyone was saying, that you have to make sure that that person actually knows you very well. Let's see. Does attending conferences as an applicant applying help, and what should one do when attending one?
Don't fall asleep. I think that's the biggest thing, like, right? I mean, it's not like you're going to be able to go to one of these conferences and jump in and take a bunch of cases and show us how smart you are. I mean, that's going to be incredibly difficult. But if you go to that conference, please just don't fall asleep while you're there. We're not, on our end, I know we're not going through and looking to see whether or not you took the extra step to go to conference. But if that's something that would, give you benefit in terms of, do I feel like these people educate me enough and that the conference is something that I want to attend, then attend. But I don't think it's necessarily a deal breaker.
It's an interesting specifically in the context of, for RSNA, for us in radiology, this huge, like massive conference with tens of thousands of individuals for it. And if you just sort of look at the roster of speakers, the different types of topics you have, you could get very, very lost in all that type of stuff. So just before thinking about like the conferences and what you want to get out of it, think about yourself and say, like, what do you care about? What are you passionate about? And in doing so, you'll find that you connect yourself with a community that you'll find yourself connecting with for the rest of your career. So for me, I care about public health. I care about breast imaging. I care about sort of linking the two of those things. So I went to talks that reflected that. And even during RSNA, I would go to talks and find that, and I would find myself connecting with people that I still connect with to this day. From going from a medical student to a resident to a faculty member. So I would just use these conferences to, reflect on what you're trying to get out of it and see what you do, and you'll find yourself connecting with your community.
Great. So I have to take a gap year because I didn't match. What should I do with that year to put me in a good light when reapplying?
So I think there you have to have an honest assessment of where you are as an applicant and what were your shortcomings. During that time, I would probably meet with a mentor or someone that's a program director and really find what your shortcomings are and use that gap year to address the shortcomings on your application. You don't want to waste a year and come back applying with the same shortcomings that allowed you to not match the first time around.
That's like exactly what I was thinking, is figure out like where the gaps were and find a mentor. Like this is where the mentorship is probably the key. And like have them help you throughout the year, trying to fill in those gaps, try to meet people. I think like if you need to rematch, the relationships are going to be very important. Be more targeted about where you're trying to match into and try to develop relationships at those sites, essentially. It can also help. And so I think like for you, I would use that year as like a relationship building year across radiology.
Fair enough. For those who are couple matching, at what point during the interview should we mention this?
Yeah, I think you can mention it early. I think you should mention it early because especially if the program wants you, what they're doing behind the scenes is they're talking to the other program. So if you have like somebody in peds and you're in radiology, we're going to call the peds person and be like, what do you think about your pediatric resident who's couple matching with our radiology resident? And then we're going to have a conversation about that. So tell them early.
Yeah, I actually couples matched. So I have some experience with this. I would mention early and often. As Melissa was saying, you really want to make sure that both programs know about both of you. And you can actually use this to help one or the other get an interview. So if one gets an interview, then you email your that radiology program and say, hey, my partner got an interview. We're really interested in your program. And that can work in both of your favor.
That's correct. I would agree with that. And here's the constant question, which I still don't really know the answer to. If we're dual applying to different specialties, and I imagine this could include the IRDR, is it advisable to apply to both programs at the same institution?
I guess my question to that is, when you say dual applying to different specialties, DR and IRDR, I could see lots of overlap between those two, and I could see some similarities that could kind of make sense. But then if somebody's applying in two drastically different specialties, you may want to take a step back and think about what are you applying into, and does it really make sense? Because if you're applying in stuff that's fairly disparate, you may want to sort of take a moment and figure out what you're really passionate about. And even if it doesn't necessarily be successful at the beginning outset, if you're persistent for that, just as with the gap year and stuff like that too, people I think do reward that grit, that persistence.
I guess stated in a different way, would you know that they are applying in another specialty if it isn't DR and IRDR? So say they're applying into surgery as well, would you receive that information? And if you did, would it make you think less of their application?
So
I was gonna say that you're not in like direct, sorry.
it's okay. Go ahead, Melissa.
I'm gonna say, I don't think that we directly get that information from anybody. Like, we just see our applications, but I've seen several times where in the personal statement, somebody was like, and I'm so glad to be matching into surgery. And then you're like, well, that's not what you're applying for over here. So I think you have to be careful about your applications if you're going down that path. If it's DRIR, I think it's a lot more like people do that, and it makes more sense. But when you're on the DR interview, make sure that you are interested in diagnostic radiology, and that you don't spend the whole time talking about interventional radiology, because I think like the MAT is a little bit different for every program, but DR has some input into the IR/DR candidates. So you want to be clear that that's what you want to do, but they don't want to take somebody who's going to be like slacker on the diagnostic radiology rotations. So make sure you show interest in both.
I was going to say the same thing, Melissa. I've seen it with people's letters of recommendation also, where they've mixed up who they were sending their letters of recommendation to. So these surgery LORs went to my radiology program, and I've had to call the institution and be like, hey, just so you know that this is what happened. So if you're going to do that, just make sure that you are clear in sending the correct letters to the correct program. And you may even want to make sure that you've got different sets of people writing both letters, so that you minimize the risk of a person who's supposed to be writing you two different letters sending the wrong one to the wrong place. So get two different sets of people writing the letters so that you can minimize the chance of that mistake.
That would be unfortunate. And so then we'll finish it out with, what are your thoughts on people who apply to both IR and IRDR? As all diagnostic radiologists here and people who are interviewing students and then therefore making these decisions, if someone is applying to DRIR, when you're looking at their DRI application, are you thinking, oh, they're just going to do ESIR and therefore there's a reason not to pick them?
I would agree with what Melissa said earlier. I think we kind of know that the DIR programs are very competitive to get into. And so it's very understandable that applicants are applying to both DR and DIR. But as she said, just make sure that when you're on that interview, that you're not just solely talking about interventional radiology. We want to make sure that you value the DR residency part of it as well, because you're going to spend your first 3 years doing that.
All right, fair enough. Well, now it is that 5 o'clock hour, so we will say au revoir to our attendings. Dr. Narayan, Dr. Bradshaw, Dr. Davis, it was a pleasure. And now it is the residents and fellows' turn. So we have Dr. Conyers, myself, Dr. Lake, Dr. Olandi, Juan, who doesn't have his last name there, and more, Miller and Ferez. So you can turn on your cameras. And so this part is really, my camera's not working, so I apologize. Let's see. So this part is entirely for trainees, for applicants and medical students to ask their questions that they are afraid to ask when other people are around. So I will actually stop recording now.